This is episode 30 of the Life in Norway show. A few years ago, British long-distance cyclist Andrew Sykes attempted to cycle from the south of Spain all the way to the Nordkapp at the very top of the Norwegian mainland. Andrew joins me today to chat about what inspired the 7,000-kilometre journey, how to plan and undertake a long-distance cycle ride through Norway, and some of the memories and challenges he faced along the way. You can find links to everything we talk about, including a full written interview with Andrew, on the show notes page. Simply head on over to lifeinnorway.net/podcast and look for episode 30. Happy listening. I'm joined today by Andrew Sykes, a British cyclist, the author of Spain to Norway on a Bike Called Reggie, and the owner of the website and podcast Cycling Europe. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Yeah, hi David. Thank you for inviting me along.
It's a pleasure. We spoke several years ago for an article actually on Life in Norway, and people can head on over to the show notes page to read that interview. It'll give a little extra colour on some of the topics we talk about today. But I wanted to invite you on the show just to have a chat now that several years have passed since your trip, just to talk about your memories and maybe some planning advice for other people who are looking to do a similar trip. But first of all, what actually persuaded you to do a long distance cycle ride, not just through Norway, but through the whole of Europe?
Well, a long story, but to cut it fairly short, it was way back in 2008, I think. No, I think it was even before that. It was probably about 2006. And I was a teacher at the time, and I had the long summer holidays. And for whatever reason, I can't remember the reason why, but in 2006, I hadn't planned to do anything in the long summer holidays. And I was getting really bored at home. And in fact, it wasn't 2006. It must have been 2008 because it was the Beijing Olympics on the TV. And I was watching the Beijing Olympics, and I was watching the women's cyclists. It was a Sunday morning, UK time. And I was watching the women's cyclists cycle around the Great Wall of China. Or through it and underneath it, rather than along it. A very, very wet day in China, just throwing it down. And Nicole Cook won the gold medal. It was one of the first events of that Olympics, and she won the first gold medal for Britain. And I remember I sat there on this Sunday morning in the middle of August in Britain thinking, God, it must be exciting to do something like that, to go off and cycle somewhere adventurous, somewhere exotic. And I quickly came up with the plan of, I didn't end up in China, still yet to end up in China, but I did decide to cycle somewhere long distance. And I had to think, well, where could I go? And at the time, I had a colleague him and his wife had just bought a house in southern Italy. So I started to plan a cycle from London, or from Reading, where I was living at the time, down to visit him and his wife in southern Italy, in Puglia, in 2010. And that's exactly what I did. So 2 years after coming up with the idea, set off in the late July of 2010 and finally arrived in southern Italy. It was when I came back that someone said to me, I'd been keeping a blog, I'd been writing about what I'd been doing, posting a few pictures. But when I got back, one of my friends said to me, oh, you should... She was actually pregnant that summer, and I think she'd been reading everything that I'd been writing, and she'd enjoyed it. And she said, "Oh, you should write a book. You turn it into a book." And I'm thinking, well, I'm a French teacher, for goodness sake. I don't write books. So anyway, the following year, I saw her again. We were chatting, and she said to me again, "You really should turn that into a book." And it was the Easter holidays this time. And I thought, well, okay, I'll give it a go. And I sat down at the computer, started typing. And I really enjoyed the process of writing the book. It was almost like reliving, well, it was reliving the journey from from your keyboard. And it was really interesting just going over the journey, filling in the detail that I didn't know at the time, thinking about the options that had been available to me, reflecting in a comical way upon the various escapades that I'd had, the problems that I'd had, the weather, the broken spokes in my bike, etc., etc. And then 2-3 months later, I found, well, I had in effect written a book, which I then self-published, and which, much to my amazement, people downloaded, people bought it, people read it, and they enjoyed what they'd read. So I thought, and all these people who were reading it were emailing me back saying how they'd been inspired by me to cycle to southern Italy, which is all a bit kind of bizarre. And I thought, well, if I'm inspiring these other people, I better inspire myself and do another trip, a kind of a longer trip, a bit more adventurous. And the problem with the trip in 2010 to southern Italy is that until I got to Rome, it was very wet and quite cold to say I was cycling in August. And so I was determined if I were to do a second trip, I was going to go somewhere a lot warmer. And I looked at the map of Europe. I looked at the Eurovelo routes that I'd kind of been following. And I thought, there's one route there that really guarantees hot weather and wall-to-wall blue skies. And that was to cycle from southern Greece to southern Portugal along the Eurovelo 8, which was the Mediterranean route. And I did that in 2013. And it certainly was hot, and it was certainly wall-to-wall blue sky. In fact, it didn't rain once. I remember being in the Pyrenees one day, praying for rain. So it was a complete turnaround from the previous trip in 2010. And I wrote about that as well. I wrote a second book called Along the Med, and again, people enjoyed it, and people read it, and they were inspired by what I'd done, and there were all these people going off and goodness knows what, doing their own bike rides. So I looked at the map of Europe and I thought, well, okay, I've got to do a third one because, good things come in threes. And I thought, well, where can I go which would kind of outdo the previous two rides? And there was one area of Europe that I hadn't really, I'd never visited either on the bike or off the bike, and that was Scandinavia. I'd been to most of the places in Western Europe, certainly, but Scandinavia I hadn't. So I came up with the idea of cycling from the geographical southernmost point of Europe, which is in southern Spain, to a place called Tarifa, to, as you and your listeners probably know well, the northernmost point, which is obviously Nordkapp in Norway. And I decided that in 2015, that's the journey that I would do. And that's exactly what I did from April until August of 2015.
For various reasons, I'm actually talking to you today from Copenhagen. And if listeners have never been here, this is one of Europe's main cycling cities, I would say. The cycling infrastructure here is absolutely fantastic. I had to walk past some double-decker bike racks outside the train station, and there were literally thousands, not hundreds, but thousands of cycles outside the train station this evening. Now, Copenhagen was on your route from southern Spain to northern Norway, probably around halfway, I would think, just from rudimentary geography. But not everywhere on the route is going to have such good infrastructure. So how do you go about planning such an epic journey of 7,000 kilometers? I mean, now there's a website, your website, cyclingeurope.org, has a lot of information about the route that you've done. But of course, that didn't exist when you were planning your journey. So how did you go about it?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily recommend people go to my website for a detailed plan. I mean, there are GPS tracks on there which kind of show you where I went on the second and the third trips, not the first trip, unfortunately, to southern Italy, but certainly the most recent two. But if people ask me how do I go about planning, well, again, I didn't really plan in any kind of detail. Clearly, you look at a map and you can see where Tarifa is, you can see where Nordkapp is, and getting back to what you were saying originally, what persuaded me to cycle through Norway, well, when I trace, and I'm doing it now on my computer screen with my mouse, if I trace a line from Tarifa in the south there are various options. You could, if you want to, go along the coast of eastern Spain and then through Switzerland, through Germany, and perhaps up through Denmark that way. The route I took was kind of north to northern Spain and then heading east along the Camino Santiago, albeit in the wrong direction, and then across France, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Denmark. But you get to a point where actually all routes would coalesce in somewhere in southern Norway. I suppose you could go up the side of the Baltic and then that way, but when you've got the option of cycling along the coast of Norway, then I think you'd be daft to turn it down. And you've got ideas and dreams of cycling in places like the Lofoten Islands and across the Arctic Circle, by the side of the Norwegian Sea. For me, it was a bit of a no-brainer to choose that route through Norway.
Okay, let's get into the details now. You've teased us a little here with some of your memories from Norway. So, what were some of those most memorable moments from the trip within Norway?
Well, I crossed over from I'd been cycling up the western coast of Sweden through Gothenburg, and that in itself is a beautiful area north of Gothenburg. If you ever get, I think it's called the Lake District or something like that. Lots of little islands, beautiful, and then headed into Oslo. Oslo was, as you know, I'm sure, is a beautiful small scale city, very, very welcoming, really interesting. I spent most of the day actually at the Fram Museum.
Oh, okay.
Learning about Friedrich Nansen, which it was interesting having been brought up in Britain and hearing about polar explorers from the perspective of Scott of the Antarctic, as I'm sure you were when you presumably were brought up in Britain. It was fascinating seeing it from the other side, in effect from the guy who got there first, who was Friedrich Nansen. So Oslo was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. And then I don't think I was expecting the mountains of Norway to kick in so soon. I kind of almost expected the big hills to be in the north, but they weren't. The big hills of Norway, as I'm sure you're aware, are in the south. And that was some strenuous climbing to get over the mountain, or to the plateau on top of the mountains. Some wonderful cycling across north of Lillehammer in the direction of Trondheim. And then as soon as I hit the coast at Trondheim, it was a case of gradually following is it the FV17, I think it's called? It's famed for being one of the most beautiful roads in the world. I think it's the FV17. And it's a fantastic route because you probably spend 3/4 of your time on roads cycling, but so often you have to catch a ferry. So whenever the road runs out, you jump on another ferry and you go to the next little bit of land. And sometimes it's an island, sometimes it's not the island, but the road itself just it links all these tiny little ferry ports together, and you gradually make your way up to got to Bodo. That was that north? Is that north of the Arctic Circle?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, just north, I think. And then across over to the Lofoten Islands. That was a longer ferry route down to the southern tip of the Lofoten Islands. And then the Lofoten Islands themselves are just beautiful. In fact, I have as my Google screensaver a picture that I found recently of those fish drying racks on the Lofoten Islands, and just a stunningly beautiful place with the mountains shooting out of the sea in a way that really I've never seen elsewhere. And then continuing further north through beautiful places like Tromsø, and then eventually at the end of my journey at Nordkapp itself, and through an interesting journey through the Nordkapp tunnel.
I remember talking to you about this before. Having driven to the Nordkapp, I know the roads up there. Well, it's a road, really. We're not talking plural, road that goes to Nordkapp. And normally cyclists in Norway are not allowed to go through road tunnels. There's normally an alternative way around or something like that. But the road tunnel to Nordkapp is the only way there, and cyclists are allowed to go through. And it's a fairly long tunnel from what I recall, and it's also a pretty dark, narrow, and not a very attractive tunnel. What was it like heading through there?
Unpleasant. I was so glad to get to the side. It was the penultimate day of the trip, and actually the weather from I'd camped at a place called Olderfjord, just south of Nordkapp overnight, and the weather on that penultimate day, I was heading for Honningsvåg on the island of Nordkapp. The weather was, I don't think I've ever experienced such dreadful weather on or off a bike along that coastal road in July of 2015. So actually to get into the tunnel was a bit of a relief, because at least the weather wasn't being thrown at me by the elements. So getting in the tunnel was actually quite nice, but but it is not a pleasant environment to be on a bike. I'd already been through lots and lots of tunnels in Norway. As you say, a lot of tunnels you're forbidden for traveling through as a cyclist. But when there is no alternative, you get directed through the tunnel, and they're not pleasant places to be, but at least they're on the flat. The problem with the Nordkapp tunnel is that it's not on the flat. It's an undersea tunnel, and as anybody who's driven through it will know, you spend the first third of the journey heading quite steeply downwards, and then it's flat for a few kilometers, and then at the end again a few kilometers quite steeply heading back up to sea level. So all in all, it's not a pleasant environment to be in, and however wonderful the Norwegian drivers might be, they can be a little bit impatient sometimes when they're in a tunnel. They perhaps don't always give you the room that you'd like as a cyclist, simply because the amount of room available down there is fairly limited to begin with. And the other thing, which takes some getting used to, apart from the temperature, apart from the wetness, apart from the gradient on the bits on the end and the beginning, is the noise. If you are traveling through a tunnel and you hear a noise, but you look ahead and you think, well, I can't see anything. I can't see anything, because the sound does give the impression of coming from all directions. And then suddenly from behind you get a lorry or a coach or whatever. Not a pleasant experience. And I was very, very, very glad to appear back into the horrible weather on the other side and Nordkapp Island itself.
Now, that island in particular, although you're almost at the finish line, there's not a great deal to see on that island. It's treeless. It's pretty barren. So what did you actually do once you arrived at Nordkapp? Did you have a celebration planned, or was it just a case of biking up to the visitor centre and grabbing a beer to celebrate?
Well, I certainly did that. One of the nicest things I've learned through these long distance cycles is actually, or rather, when I did the very first one of my big concerns was actually that I would be lonely, that I would never speak to anybody, that I would just, at the end of X number of weeks, I would be tearing my hair out because I'd be dreadfully sad and dreadfully lonely. One of the first things you learn after you've been cycling on your own for a few days is the fact that you are constantly interrupted in a nice way. You're constantly stopped by people come up to you and chat, where you going, where have you come from, why are you doing it, etc., etc. People are genuinely curious, and you actually meet a lot of people. You're never lonely. But you do meet a lot of people, and it can become quite wearying meeting different people and having to explain to them over and over and over again, different people, that is, why you're there, where you're going, where you've come from, etc. In northern Norway, when I got to Bodø, I think it was slightly before Bodø, I met a couple of Germans, Hans, who was in his early 60s, and his daughter, who was in her 20s, and they were heading in the same direction as me, and they were heading at roughly the same speed, or cycling at roughly the same speed as me. They'd started in Trondheim. I bumped into them in the Bodø area, and over the course of the final 2 weeks of the trip, I saw them regularly, and they became really good friends. We didn't really cycle much together, but invariably we would see each other at the campsite in the evening. We would occasionally have breakfast together. We might even bump into each other at a cafe en route. But they became really good friends. So actually, the nice thing about arriving in Honningsvåg was that we happened to be, we both, or all three of us, stayed at the youth hostel in Honningsvåg, and then we kind of planned our plan of action for that final day. I set off well before them. I arrived at about midday at Nordkapp, and they arrived perhaps 3 in the afternoon. But then it was nice to have somebody to celebrate with. And I remember toasting with peach schnapps at courtesy of Hans, just on the makeshift campsite just outside the complex there. And the other nice thing about arriving in Nordkapp was that I arrived on July the 28th, 2015, which was officially the final day that you could see the midnight sun. And it was touch and go, because it was quite a cloudy day, and the crowds gathered and then began to disperse just before midnight, because people thought, well, this is just not going to happen. But then as the clock ticked towards midnight and the sun headed towards the horizon, albeit not passing through it, it appeared from below the clouds, and we got to see the midnight sun, which was rather magical. A nice way to end the trip.
Lovely. Okay, Andrew, let's say that there are some listeners who want to do something similar, whether they want to do the whole length of Europe like you have, or the whole length of Norway, or just a long distance trip within Norway. Let's talk some practical advice. Now, you've mentioned campsites, so let's start with accommodation. I assume to keep the budget down, were you wild camping every night, or staying in cabins? How did that work?
I'm the world's worst wild camper. I don't think have I done it. I think the first time I did it actually was the night at Nordkapp, which wasn't really wild camping because there were lots of people there who had camped. There wasn't an official campsite. It is one thing I've never felt comfortable doing. So I usually seek out a campsite. At the beginning of the trip in Spain, it was very early in the season, and campsites weren't open. So I did stay in quite a few cheap hostels and hotels in Spain. Then in France and Belgium and Germany, it was a lot easier. Denmark, likewise, very easy to camp. And likewise, moving into Scandinavia. I think there was a period, I think it was something like 20 consecutive nights in a tent from somewhere in Norway up to Nordkapp, I think. And that was my preferred way to be accommodated. I like camping. It's a nice way to be at one with the environment. It's a nice way to meet other people in a way that you can't really do when you're in a hotel and you're stuck in your room. So that said, I did occasionally splash out on a decent hotel, and I got to a place called, let me just think, it was north of Trondheim. It was Namsos, yes, Namsos, the place that's famous for the rockers, and that the weather had been, again, it had been a dreadful day. It had rained all day long, and I arrived in Namsos. I'd found a campsite, but I thought, there's no way I'm gonna camp tonight. So I just thought, oh, I don't care, and I cycled up to this very nice looking hotel next to Rock City, and I stayed in the Scandic Rock City overnight. So, but over the course of the whole trip, I think if you averaged out the amount that I spent per night, it would have been probably somewhere around, I don't know, 20, 30 euros perhaps per night, which in the great scheme of things is pretty cheap.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should also point out, because people come from different countries who are listening to the show, wild camping in Norway, and actually I think all of Scandinavia is free. It's a right. It's in law. I'll link to a page in the show notes that gives more detail about this. You have to be a certain distance from private property, but you are allowed to pitch a tent and spend a night there. But of course, doing that night after night after night is probably not conducive to a nice, efficient cycle trip. You're going to want some creature comforts along the route, a shower, for instance, and maybe a kitchen once or twice as well.
Yeah, I admit to being an utter wimp when it comes to wild camping, and I look back and I think, God, you really should have tried a bit harder. I regularly cycle past people in idyllic positions next to a fjord or on the side of a mountain with their tent, and I thought I could perhaps camp there. But then I don't know, perhaps I'd seen on the internet a picture of a nice campsite that I was aiming for a bit further along, and I thought, oh well, I'll keep going to the campsite, and I usually did find idyllic campsites next to fjords where I had to pay 20 euros, but that was it.
When it comes to clothing, were you kind of all geared up like a professional cyclist, or did you keep things simple?
When I was cycling through, it was a strange one in terms of clothing, because Spain was beginning of spring. It was a mixture of hot and cool, the weather. When I got into France, it was nice and warm, and Belgium and Germany and Denmark likewise quite warm. But I knew that when I got to Sweden and certainly in Norway, the hot weather was not guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination, even though I was cycling in July. So when I was in Hamburg, I was staying with some friends for a kind of a pit stop of, I think I was there 2, if not 3 nights. And I used the opportunity of being there to have the bike serviced. And I also kind of changed a lot of my clothing. And I kind of reverted to what I would normally wear for cycling in winter in Britain. And actually, the most comfortable thing I wore, I think almost continuously from Hamburg all the way to Nordkapp, was a pair of walking trousers. I used those on the bike, and they kept me warm, if not necessarily always dry.
And for the bike itself, are we talking a regular road bike here, or something more like a hybrid?
Well, the eponymous Reggie of the books, he is a Ridgeback Panorama bike, which is a very good touring bike. It's an off the peg touring bike. You can, I bought mine about 10 years ago now. If you bought it brand new now, it would cost you probably around £1,200-1,300. It's a good bike, and they're very popular for long distance cyclists. So that's what I was cycling, and that's what I was using. I used it for all 3 of those trips. I have to say that I have just in the last few weeks ordered a brand new bike, which has cost me an absolute fortune, and I daren't admit to anybody. I haven't told anybody yet, apart from the chap who I bought it from, how much it's costing me. So please don't ask me. But it makes me wince when I think. You can buy reasonably priced touring bikes, good quality touring bikes, without necessarily breaking the bank. Clearly, you can break the bank and pay a lot more, as I am in the process of doing. But that was the bike.
Andrew, any other memories from Norway that you'd like to share? Any little anecdotes, perhaps a funny story that we could find in the book?
Well, the lots of funny stories in the book. I remember the wildlife was interesting. I had various close encounters. I remember just north of Oslo, I was cycling by the side of a road, and I glanced to just a few meters to the side, and I thought, oh, that's a big horse. And I kept cycling. And then there was a woman who had stopped. She was also on her bike. She was just a local. She stopped and she got off her bike and was pointing at the horse. And I had to look at this horse again, and I thought, oh, that got funny ears. And she explained in her broken English to me that actually she'd never seen an elk so close to Oslo before. And she said that we needed to be careful, because if you got in the way of, or if you happen to be positioned between the elk and its calf, then they could be potentially dangerous animals. But and then I had another experience further north. I never saw any bears. I was a little bit worried that I might come across bears, because you do have bears in Norway, don't you? Apparently,
yeah, there are some brown bears, but they tend to be along the border with Sweden. It's heavily forested area.
Yeah.
I don't think there's many, but there are some.
Well, I never, thankfully, bumped into one. Although I did. There's a bit in the book about how to escape a bear, I think, because I did do the research. But the other wildlife close encounter I had was way up in the north. In fact, it was in the last few days when I was cycling below a very. It was next to some water with a cliff to my left, and I was observing these large birds of prey that were kind of flying around the cliff, and from a distance they looked fine. And I was cycling along the edge of the water, which was at the bottom of this cliff, and this enormous bird, which turned out to be a buzzard, was getting lower and lower, and then as I approached, I thought, "Oh my goodness, that bird is actually coming to attack me," and I suddenly went into terrified mode and pedalled like I've never pedalled in my life before. I could see at the edge of the water on the far end of the cliff was some trees, and I thought, "Oh, I just need to get in those trees just to get." So this bird won't swoop down and attack me. And there happened to be two people sitting by the side of the lake, and I cycled like I'd never cycled before. Got into this wood, and then pushed the bike to the edge of the lake where these two people were sat very calmly, eating their lunch and just watching the whole thing pan out. And I didn't even bother with the rudimentary politeness of "Do you speak English?" I just launched into English, and I blurted out something like, "Did you see that bird nearly kill me as I was cycling on that road?" And the chap just looked at me rather calmly and said, "Oh, you don't worry, you were never in any danger whatsoever." He was just trying to frighten you off, which was good news. But
and he succeeded.
Well, yeah, well, quite. But the contrast between my state of extreme panic at the thought of being attacked by a ravenous bird of prey, and his calm, collected, "Oh, don't worry about it. It was just a buzzard trying to warn you off," was extreme, to say the least.
I've just taken a look, and there are actually 150 brown bears living in Norway at the moment, estimated amount. Okay. Yeah, and a good portion of those are on that stretch you mentioned north of Oslo, along the border with Sweden. And then there are some a little north of Trondheim, and then quite a lot of the Russian population along the border with Russia as well. So, yeah.
There is a section, like I said in the book, and I did do the research, and there's what's the name of the book I read? I got hold of a pamphlet, or downloaded a pamphlet from the Norwegian authorities, or it could have been the Swedish authorities, written in English, and it was along the lines of how to survive being attacked by a bear, or something like that, and some excellent advice. But I fortunately never had to put it into practice.
Well, it looks like the numbers were as high as 3,000 around 100 years ago, so it's never been safer to cycle through Norway when it comes to brown bears.
All right, well, that's good to hear.
Andrew, this has been really interesting. I've certainly learned a lot. I'm sure listeners have too. Where can people find out more about your journey through Norway, and some of your other projects?
Well, the website cyclingeurope.org is still going strong, and I still write for that on a regular occurrence. If you visit cyclingeurope.org at the moment, you'll see my current obsession is the purchase of the new bike and all the bits and pieces to do with that. But there's information, and lots of information there, about the 3 long cycles, about the books, and just generally lots of other bits and pieces about cycling long distances, especially within Europe. You can also find me on social media at Cycling Europe on the various different channels of social media. And you can find the books in, as they say, in all good bookshops, and probably a few not so good bookshops.
Well, I didn't tell you this before we started recording, but the reason I got in touch with you is I came across your book in a bookstore in Trondheim just last week, standing there on the shelf. And I recognised it straight away, of course. So that reminded me of you and your story. So whether it's in all Norwegian bookstores or not, I do not know, but it's certainly in the bookstore in Trondheim Torg in Trondheim city centre. And that book, of course, is called Spain to Norway on a Bike Called Reggie. It's by Andrew Sykes. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.